Very often in the modern world, people think that medieval weapons were actually heavier than they in reality were. And obviously movies have a large part to blame for this, as people have been seen swinging around what apparently heavy weapons and getting exhausted by using them, but the reality is that things like medieval longswords only weighed 3 or 4 pounds maximum usually. While swords have got lots of attention on the internet, a type of weapon which often gets overlooked is polearms, and people often assume that polearms are heavier than they are. In reality, maybe not as heavy as you thought. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm going to keep this fairly brief today because it's a fairly simple topic. The simple headline here is that polearms, pole weapons, hafted weapons, shafted weapons, they go by many different names, but things on a long stick are often not as heavy as people think they're going to be. They are generally speaking heavier than swords, though not always. I'll get back to that in a moment. But these are often not as heavy as people think they're going to be. So commonly, I think a lot of people think that a medieval broadsword or longsword or arming sword is somewhere in the region of sort of 5, 6 or 7 pounds in weight. You can convert that to metric if you so choose. However, the irony here is that many poleaxes actually only weigh 4, 5 or 6 pounds. So actually the weights that people often think that large swords are going to be is actually the weight of much, much bigger weapons like this. Now, the fact that they are heavier has two interesting effects. First of all, although the literal weight is heavier than swords, remember of course that you are holding these with your hands further apart. So actually they're pretty light and nimble. I mean, this is a poleaxe, and poleaxes are amongst the heavier pole weapons because they have so many other bits on them apart from just the head. We'll come back to that point as well in a second. So we've got a head here, we've got spike, axe, hammer, spike, back spike, hook, whatever you've got on your particular poleaxe. But you've also got these languettes here. Sometimes you have a handguard, as this example does, and very often you have a calcio, as the Italians would call it, or shoe or foot at the back end here. The cul, as the French would call it in Le Jeu de la Hache, which is a brilliant treatise on how to use these things. So this is actually one of the heavier types of pole weapon or shafted weapon, but they're really, really manageable because of course your hands are a long way apart from each other. This incidentally, although I'm talking here about European medieval and Renaissance weapons, would also apply for Chinese, Japanese and whatever. So they are heavier, but not as heavy as you think. And if we look at some examples here, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we can see that very often certain types of poleaxe, for example, are in the sort of 5 pound, sometimes into the 6 pound kind of weight range. Sometimes they're lighter, sometimes they're more like 4 pounds, but sometimes that can be because parts are missing off the shaft. But what about something like halberds? Are halberds heavier or lighter? Well, I've actually got, so we've been using these. These are obviously very light because these are fake steel. They're not real steel. So we've actually got some halberd heads at the moment from Fake Steel Armory. I'll stick a link down to them. These are really, really good because one of the effects of using pole weapons is because the hands are so far apart and you've got so much leverage and energy generation in shafts, unless you're wearing full harness, you can't really spar with pole arms very easily, at least not the swinging type. Spears you can manage, but the swinging types just hit with so much force, even just the bare stick. And this is rattan, but if you use ash, even more. Just the bare stick, it's a quarterstaff at the end of the day, hits with so much force that it, you know, concussions and broken bones abound. So they're not very safe to spar with in a HEMA or even a LARP kind of situation. So having some type of forgivable head, and these are made of type of foam obviously, is really, really good because this means that we can now spar with these more safely. Sure, it's lighter and sure, it's not exactly like the real thing, but you know, it lets people have some fun with something that's the right shape and size. Now, halberds, interestingly, a lot of people will say, what's the difference between a halberd and a poleaxe? It's really to do with the construction and the fact that the halberd is predominantly used with the head end most of the time, whereas the poleaxe turns around a lot more. So poleaxes tend to be shorter and they tend to have a back end on them, whereas halberds tend to only have a head end. Also, the construction's different. They tend to have a different type of socket and construction to the poleaxes. Maybe we'll look at that in more depth at some point. But interestingly, again, if we look at the Metropolitan Museum of Art website and actually go through the different halberds. They've got loads, in fact, at the Met. If you go through different halberds there, you'll see some as light as £4. Very often they're about £5. Occasionally they're into the £6 range. It depends on the exact shape and style of the head and whether it's got holes in it and cutouts and to make it lighter and things like this. And also period to, you know, what era it's from to some extent as well. So simply to say that these polearms are, even those are not particularly heavy, because you still want them to be usable and you want to be able to use them quickly and nimbly and hit your opponent before they hit you, and parry and defend with the things as you want to be able to do and turn them around. You don't want weapons which are overly cumbersome most of the time. There are some weapons out there which are particularly heavy for specific reasons, but generally speaking, even these big polearms want to be relatively quick, relatively manageable. So yes, most people in the world now know that swords, even big broad blades like this, are lighter than many people used to think they were in D&D games and everything else. These are lighter, but so are polearms generally speaking. And even the biggest polearms, things like halberds and poleaxes, the most beefy ones, even those are not particularly heavy. And the last point I said I would come back to is, ironically, when we get to the big two-handed swords, sometimes these are heavier than these, but there's an important thing to remember. Swords are balanced closer to the hilt end or back end, and therefore generally nimbler for their weight. But remember that £5, while it's not a lot of weight as a raw weight, is mostly on the head of the weapon. So these pole weapons, as I mentioned before, in sparring they hit really hard and it's really difficult to make safe sparring versions of them. So although this weapon might only weigh 5.5, 6 pounds, most of that is towards the head, and once you swing it, it has a lot of momentum and they hit really, really hard. So as I mentioned, the combination of leverage, even just a bare stick would hit hard. The combination of leverage, the fact that your hands are far apart and you can accelerate it quicker, and the fact that most of the mass is towards the end of the lever instead of the base of the lever like with a sword. Even though these aren't as heavy as you might think, they actually can hit harder than I think some people realise. Anyway, hopefully that's some thought-provoking stuff, and as always, thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton, I'll continue to be. Always welcome to take suggestions in the comments down below if there's something you'd like me to do a deeper dive on, anything to do with polearms, halberds, poleaxes, whatever, or indeed the use of these things and techniques and stuff like that. So always happy to take suggestions, or it could be something completely different. Anyway, take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.